Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Teacher Talk. I want to thank everybody that's subscribed to the videos. I want to thank y'all for all the comments and stuff. It sounds like y'all are enjoying the videos, and that's good. And hopefully you're learning something along the way. So we are approaching the climactic moment in our story of Ruth and Boaz at the end of chapter 3. Remember that Ruth followed Naomi's instructions on the night of the harvest. She approached Boaz respectfully to invite a marriage proposal, and she was rewarded with Boaz's promise to redeem her one way or another. She spent the evening with Boaz without anyone being the wiser, so that Boaz's reputation and Ruth's reputation would not be compromised. But Boaz also told Ruth that there was a legal hurdle preventing him from redeeming Ruth. So we're going to rejoin the conversation in Ruth chapter 3, verse 11. It says, "Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. Now, it is true I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good. Let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning and rose before one could recognize another. And he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." Again, he said, "Give me the cloak that is on you and hold it." So she held it, and he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city. When she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did it go, my daughter?" And she told her all that the man had done for her. She said, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, 'Do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed.' Then she said, 'Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled it today.'" So, as Boaz explains, he is prohibited from acting to redeem Ruth because another man in the family was a closer relative. And that word in Hebrew for closer relative is Kinsman-Redeemer. So Boaz is essentially saying that he can't redeem Ruth because he's not legally the closest relative. He's not the kinsman-redeemer. The other man is technically the one who has to act to redeem Ruth. But Boaz says that if this man isn't able to redeem her for any reason, then Boaz is prepared to step in and assume that responsibility. Now, Boaz is not obligated to act in this way at all. He's volunteering to assume this role in case Ruth is found to be without a redeemer. So Boaz protects Ruth through the night. He would have been within his rights to ask Ruth to go back home. If someone had seen her lying at his feet, it would have brought shame to him. The gossip would have started. The rumors would have started. But nevertheless, he puts her safety above his own reputation. A young girl walking at night alone was a recipe for disaster back then, just as it is today. So Boaz protects her at risk to himself. But in keeping the visit secret, he's also protecting Ruth. He's protecting her reputation. In verse 14, we see Boaz giving direction to his servants not to report that she had been with him. He wasn't asking them to lie, because no one's going to come up to him and say, "Hey, did something happen last night that shouldn't have?" He's just telling people not to volunteer the information. He's asking them for discretion to prevent gossip and lying. In addition, Boaz continued caring for Ruth and Naomi's needs. In the past, they were allowed to glean in the fields, but now the harvest is over, so the gleaning is over. So Boaz gave Ruth a generous portion of his grain to take to Naomi, once again caring for Naomi through Ruth. The text says 6 measures of barley. A measure was probably 2 hand scoops, maybe, give or take, a little more, a little less, but it would have been enough to keep her and Naomi fed for several more days. Now, the fact that he sent her with enough grain for a few days is in itself an indication of how quickly he planned to move on this matter. He wasn't expecting these women to be alone for much longer. And Naomi picks up on this sign when Ruth returns. When Ruth tells her what happened and shows Naomi the 6 measures of barley, Naomi immediately understands what's going on. She knows the meaning. She says, wait, my daughter, let's see how this turns out. He won't rest until this matter is settled today. Or if you want to say it another way, Boaz can only rest after he has redeemed Ruth. So we can safely assume Boaz's speed is an indication of his desire for Ruth as a potential bride. And sure enough, chapter 4 opens with Boaz acting quickly. Chapter 4, verse 1. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. Now, Boaz goes to the gate of the city the next morning. Why is everybody meeting at a gate? Well, the cities back then had walls. And of course, to get through the wall, you had to have a gate. And that was usually, there were sometimes multiple gates. Sometimes there was just one, but there was always a main gate, and adding a gate to a fortified wall instantly made it the most vulnerable part of the wall and the weakest link in your security. If you open the gate to let the city's residents go in and out, then you are also likely to let the bad guys in. And if someone just knocked, they're not going to open the gate. Knock, knock, who's there? Nebuchadnezzar, whatever. So gates were actually fortified chambers of rooms inside the walls, like a courtyard inside the wall. So you would enter through the outer door, and you had to pass through that chamber in order to reach the inner door leading into the city. Think about it, if you're a science fiction fan, think about it like an airlock. You've got space outside, and you've got a door into the space station or the spaceship or whatever. So you go through that door, and that door shuts behind you, and then the atmosphere pressurizes, and then you open the inner door and you go into the space station. It's kind of like that without the pressurization of the atmosphere, of course. So inside the chamber were guards positioned high above on top of the city walls that encompassed that chamber. So if an army breached the outer wall, it would hit a second door, preventing their entry into the city. And then the archers shooting from up above could pick them off in the chamber, like shooting fish in a barrel. So that's how the gates worked. But a city was a place of commerce. I mean, you had people going in, you had traders going in, you had merchants, you had visitors and stuff. People from the surrounding areas would travel into the city to conduct business, to do, whatever they had to do. They came to buy and sell. Some people lived in the city, but left to go work in the fields during the day. And if a person needed to conduct official business, he would go to the city to meet with city officials. So with all this traffic in and out of a city, how do you ensure the security of those who lived inside? Well, a practice developed to conduct as much business as possible in those chambered gates of the city. And these chambers felt like bazaars where merchants would line up to sell and to trade. And the chambers also became like a city hall, like we have today, like the courthouse or the city hall or whatever. Judges would hold court in various gates of the city during the day. And the elders of the city might convene in this space to hear from witnesses in some important matter. And a lot of people who didn't live in the city could still gain access, but in a secure way, so it doesn't compromise the security of the city. So when we hear that Boaz went up to the gate of the city of Bethlehem in verse 1, we need to understand that Boaz has gone to City Hall to meet with officials of the city. This is a civil matter, and he needs witnesses and he needs people to observe this. But he also had a second purpose in going to the gate. Since this was the primary way in and out, he goes to the gate expecting to see his closer relative. He's arrived early precisely so that he can catch this man as he leaves for the day to go work in the field, maybe, or as he leaves his home outside the city to come work in the city. And as he encounters this man, Boaz asks him to turn aside and to sit down in the gate. So now Boaz and this man are related. So the man must have recognized Boaz and stopped and said, hey, cousin, how you doing? And Boaz's invitation to sit would have been friendly, but the sitting down would have indicated or suggested something more serious was going on here. So the next thing this guy realizes, Boaz has assembled 10 men from among the elders of the city. He probably had them on call. He had probably told them earlier, hey, I'm going to need you for something. So Boaz has orchestrated the situation to put his relative on the spot in an official proceeding concerning Naomi's and Ruth's situation. And it's almost like he wanted this guy to be caught off guard just a little bit so that the situation might play to his advantage. Spring it on him all at once when he's not expecting it. Now, with Boaz and his relative and these 10 men assembled in the gate, an official inquiry is now underway. This is an official civil matter. These men are witnesses to the conversation that will take place between Boaz and the relative. So whatever they decide together will become settled in law. It'll be legal. No man will be able to go back on his word or claim that the meeting never happened or no, that's not what was said. They got 10 witnesses. Boaz wants the matter settled justly and permanently. He doesn't want any backlash on this. So that when the conversation is over with, the matter's done. It's settled. It's finished. So chapter 4, verse 3 says, then he said to the closest relative, Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you. And he said, I will redeem it. So Boaz starts this conversation announcing to this relative that Naomi has come back from the land of Moab to her property. And since her husband Elimelech is dead, Naomi would have inherited the family property that once belonged to her husband. There was no requirement that she sell her property. But as we said, it had been abandoned for 10 years. It was unproductive. It was a wasteland, basically. A woman without a son wouldn't have the ability to work the land. She was unable to do it. She was too old, for one thing, and she couldn't do the hard work that was required. So under the current circumstances, she probably had no choice but to sell the property to provide for herself. And now the law of Moses addresses this very situation in Leviticus. In Leviticus 25, verse 24, the Bible says, thus for every piece of your property, you are to provide for the redemption of the land. If a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman is to come and buy back what his relative has sold. So Naomi needed to sell the property just to survive. And under those circumstances, the law required that the nearest relative buy it. So it stays in the family. So that if somebody's in desperate circumstances, they could find a sympathetic buyer. Selling to a member of the family ensured that the land remained within the tribe, and it increased the chance that the selling price would be fair, assuming that family ties encourage honesty. It was a foregone conclusion that for the most part, you don't want to cheat your family. That's not always the case, but that was the thinking here. So Boaz turns to this relative and invites him to redeem the property, or in other words, buy the property from Naomi. If the man wouldn't buy it, Boaz says, I'm prepared to assume that responsibility and I'll buy it. Boaz is betting that the opportunity to purchase the land will be too good for the relative to pass up, and he will jump at the chance to enrich himself through a distress purchase without a bidding war. I mean, it's being handed to him on a silver platter if he'll pay the price. Finally, notice that Boaz says Elimelech was a brother to these men. Now, we don't know if he means a literal brother or if it's just, a cousin or, a relative. But regardless, we know that these men share a blood relationship. So immediately, the man says, yes, I will redeem the land, which is exactly what Boaz knew he would say. Now, Boaz has been very clever. He has played this situation well. He's drawn this man out in the open. There's no timetable according to the law on the act of redemption. So this relative had the right of first refusal as kinsman-redeemer. But legally, he could have waited forever to decide if he wanted to do it or not. And during that time, no other relative could act because nobody else was the closest relative. So by offering the land first, Boaz brought this man out of his indecisiveness and off the fence and forced him to commit. He didn't want to pass up the opportunity. So he's made a decision to purchase the land. But by committing to buy the land, the relative has also officially assumed the role of kinsman-redeemer for Naomi's family. Now, Boaz's tactics were brilliant. He gave the man an incentive to act, and he used the opportunity to purchase the land as the bait. Now, we need to draw a parallel to our day today to understand Boaz's strategy. So let's say that my brother has found a great used car for sale. The car belonged to an older man who barely drove it. It's only got 10,000 miles on it, and his widow is trying to sell it cheap. The car is a steal, and I really want to buy it. But my brother-in-law saw it first, so he gets first chance. But he's hesitating, and he won't make a decision. Now, meanwhile, I'm worried that someone else is going to buy the car while I'm waiting on him to decide if he's going to buy it. So I tell him I'm ready to buy it if he doesn't want it. And in effect, I force him to commit one way or the other to the deal. If he wants it, buy it by the end of the day. Otherwise, I'm going to go to the widow tomorrow and make the purchase. That's what Boaz has done here in forcing the relative to either act or get out of the way. Now, there's a few differences between that little illustration. First of all, Boaz is engaged in a legal question. In my little story, there's no law that says someone has to buy the widow's used car. But in Boaz's day, the law did require a kinsman-redeemer to act once he's been identified. So when this relative commits to the purchase, he has assumed the legal identity of kinsman-redeemer for Naomi's family. Once that legal identity attaches, it can't be revoked. Once the kinsman-redeemer, to become the kinsman-redeemer means assuming all the legal obligations that accompany the role. It's an all or nothing deal. In fact, the presence of the elders at this meeting is a result of the fact that there was a law at work here. So you needed some elders. This is during the time of the judges, remember. So law was adjudicated through judges and through elders. And the law required that the kinsman-redeemer should redeem the land if Naomi sold it. So in the presence of these elders, excited by the prospect of acquiring more land, the brother enthusiastically responds, I will redeem it. And that brings us to the second difference between my story and the story of Ruth. Boaz's offer came with a catch. Verse 5 says, Then Boaz said, On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. Now, Boaz reminds this relative that if you're going to assume the responsibility of kinsman-redeemer for Naomi, you have to prepare to fulfill the role in every respect. Not only must you redeem the land, but you must also be prepared to redeem the widow in Naomi's house, which is Ruth. So this would be like telling my brother-in-law, oh, I forgot to mention there's a catch. If you buy the widow's used car, you have to marry the widow. Now, that would probably diminish his interest in the deal significantly. And that's what Boaz was expecting as well. Now, remember, we talked about levirate marriage law, and it required that a redeemer marry the widow and raise the first son as the child of the deceased. Deuteronomy 25:5. When brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. It shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. So in such a case, the child born to that union was considered the legal offspring of the deceased, not of the new husband. And that's how the name of the family continued. And that child also received the inheritance rights of all the property that had previously belonged to the deceased man. So in this way, Boaz has compelled his relative into making a decision regarding his levirate marriage responsibilities. With the opportunity to buy land dangling in front of him, the relative jumped too quickly into becoming the redeemer. Now, he's also legally responsible to act as the redeemer for Naomi's family as well. Now, he probably knew that redeeming Naomi was included in the deal, but he also knew she was past childbearing years. So he probably wasn't too worried about taking on a levirate marriage in her case. But evidently, he hadn't heard about Ruth, or perhaps considered her situation as a widow, so he didn't anticipate having to marry her. Had he suspected what was coming, he might have deferred on his decision, claiming that he needed time to decide. Then he could have waited years or even decades until Ruth was past childbearing years, and at that point, he could then agree to be redeemer, but decline to marry Ruth on the basis that she couldn't be redeemed. In other words, she couldn't have children. Now, though, the relative is trapped by his own words. If this man is to be the redeemer, he must commit to taking Ruth as his wife and raising up a child to be the deceased son. Now, he can't say that he's going to wait and think about it because he's already committed to acting as a kinsman-redeemer. When he said, yes, I'll redeem it, that was it. That was his commitment. So he can't take the land without taking Ruth too. Boaz has played this excellently well. He put forth the opportunity to purchase the land first to gain the man's commitment. Then he introduced Ruth into the deal, knowing it would likely end that man's interest. The prospect of a cheap bargain on land is one thing, but entering into a marriage that you didn't see coming, that's entirely something else. And predictably, the man declines the opportunity. Look at verse 6. The closest relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. The man changes his mind very quickly. He says he can't be the kinsman redeemer after all, because it would jeopardize his own inheritance. If this man uses some of his wealth to purchase the land from Naomi, and then later he fathers a child for Naomi's family, that child would receive Naomi's property back as his inheritance. So this relative who purchased the land from Naomi would lose it without payment because it now belongs to the son. The redeemer's own wealth would have gone into purchasing the property and would never be returned to his family. So in that sense, the man was jeopardizing his family's inheritance by, in effect, transferring his wealth to Naomi's family. His love for his own wealth exceeded his love for Naomi's family, so he relinquishes the right to be kinsman redeemer. He simply could not redeem the land, nor could he redeem the family of Naomi. Now, a lot of you can probably see new parallels emerging for our second story of Christ and the church in Israel. Next week, we're going to consider those parallels, and we're going to move forward to see how the story ends. But already, we can see a picture of Christ acting to redeem his bride, acting without requirement, but out of love, acting according to the law and making a payment that somebody else couldn't make. And as we examine that question, we have to also consider, who is this closer relative who could not redeem Ruth? the closer relative is also represented in our second story. And next week, we're going to unveil his identity. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you continue to enjoy these studies. My wish is that you would learn something about the Bible and that these studies would enrich your knowledge and your understanding of God's word. Until next time, God bless.